We want to start on time, not because I mentioned it that I'm German, but also that we not kind of getting into trouble. Yesterday it was really, I have to say, on point, everything. Although it was a long day, and I know this, and we knew this in advance, but just to address this issue, we couldn't move the section at the end, the new dimension testimony, to today, what we actually planned, because of scheduling issues, and that's why it was a long day yesterday. So I apologize for this, but I hope it was still interesting and motivating enough not to kind of fall asleep. So I want to welcome you today for the second day of the conference, and I hand over to Jeremy, who will introduce himself. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jeremy Mikecz. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at USC in the digital humanities. My research is nothing to do with the Holocaust. It's 400 years earlier, thousands of miles away. I studied the conquest of Peru, early colonialism. My interest started in how digital methods, geovisualization, all those things can help us recover our history from below, particularly indigenous history. But I know from the Geographies of the Holocaust book and from these panels, there's so much that I can learn and be inspired from this research and apply to my own research. So I'm very excited to participate today. So our panelists today, in the panel Digital Visualization of Holocaust Spaces, the broader perspective, come from a diverse range of academic and disciplinary backgrounds, including cartography, design, geography, history, and archaeology, and probably several others as well, because they're all very interdisciplinary scholars. In our first paper, so I'll start with a little biography here. About 7, 8, 9 years ago, I got really interested in this concept of spatial history, historical GIS. And back then, that was kind of like the Stone Ages of this topic. There are 3 major influences. Because not a lot of people were doing this. There's Ian Gregory, who's not here. But then there's also the Stanford University Spatial History Project. And today we have one of the co-directors and co-founders, Erik Steiner. And the Spatial History Project at the Stanford University is now part of the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. Erik describes himself as an interaction designer and cartographer working at the intersection of technology, creative arts, and academic scholarship in the humanities and social and environmental sciences. He has led the design and development of dozens of projects which have received funding from the Mellon, Getty, and Crest Foundations, as well as the NEH, NSF, and ACLS. Recent collaborative work runs the gamut from Kindred London, the genealogy of ant colonies, the Rudolfo Lanciani Digital Archive, and of course the geographies of the Holocaust. Now back then, almost a decade ago, when I was looking for influences to start this research, another major influence and one of the pioneers in spatial history is Anne Kelly Knowles. She is currently the McBride Professor of History at the University of Maine. She has been a leading figure and pioneer in the digital and spatial humanities for over 2 decades. She has written or edited several books, including Placing History, which in many ways set the agenda for how GIS and geovisualization could be applied to historical scholarship. She has also written Mastering Iron, the Struggle to Modernize in American Industry, and co-edited Geographies of the Holocaust, which has shown the many new insights geovisualization, other forms of data visualization can provide to even topics as well studied as the Holocaust. Her pioneering work has received many awards, including most notably the American Ingenuity Award for Historical Scholarship and the Guggenheim Fellowship. She is also a founding member of the Holocaust Geographies and Collaborative. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first talk, which is Ways of Seeing Problems and Possibilities in Holocaust Visualization.
Is this good? Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jeremy. You all should look out for Jeremy's work. He is, to my knowledge, the first scholar to apply GIS visualization, including a wonderful application of viewshed analysis, to the Spanish conquest of Peru. Yesterday, Todd Presner cogently explained the problems and possibilities of analog and digital modes of representing knowledge. Erik and I today would like to pick up some of the threads in Todd's paper that helped frame so many of our discussions yesterday. I will focus particularly on geovisualization as an epistemology, a way of knowing. I will try to explain what I mean by that, then offer a few thoughts on the common use of maps as orientational and indexical devices in online Holocaust resources. Then I will turn to critiques of geovisualization by the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, and briefly, the question of whether our maps and graphics raise any particular ethical questions. Erik will then offer a number of alternative approaches to geovisualization based on his work at the Stanford Spatial History Lab and CESTA. Aww. PC user doesn't know how to advance. Erik, help.
No one's ever described you as PC.
Seeing is a way of knowing, said my good friend John Krieger, a cartography master's student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the time, about 30 years ago. He was falling in love with cartography as I was falling in love with geography at the time. That simple sentence has stayed with me all these years and shaped much of my scholarship, my teaching, my understanding of the world. What I would like to do today is break it down a little bit, beginning with this idea that visual methods offer more than one mode of generating and conveying knowledge. I think there was some collapsing of the category of the spatial and even the visual yesterday, though Paul kept trying to open it up for us. First, there's seeing as showing or display, which I would say is the typical use of visuals in analog humanities scholarship and many, many other realms. Then there's seeing as access or sharing, which I think is the dominant mode in much digital scholarship, in digital popular culture, digital media, and particularly for our interest today, digital resources online. There's seeing as rendering, which is the most ancient form. People drawing what they see in their minds, in their imaginations, and now, of course, that extends to drawing with computer assistance. There's seeing as exploration and discovery. This has been an enormously important way of seeing in the sciences for many decades, and it is fundamental to the approach of the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative and in cartography as well, and I'll try to circle back to that. For me, the kind of pinnacle of this pyramid, if we're thinking pyramidically or cumulatively, is that seeing is essential for spatial thinking. Whether one is thinking in one's mind, whether one is thinking by graphic ideation on the page, whether one is building databases and making maps. There are now so many digital historical projects for the Holocaust online that it's becoming difficult to keep track of them all. Those with a geographic component are most relevant for our group's interests in spatial representation and analysis. Examples include Yad Vashem's Transports to Extinction, Yahad in Unum, which you see here from the Father Dubois project on the Holocaust by Bullets, the Holocaust Atlas of Lithuania, put online by Vilna Gaon State Jewish Museum in Vilnius, based on the print atlas by Milda Yakultya-Vasil, and an Italian project called Campi Fascisti by Roman Herzog and others. These sites share a number of characteristics that I'd like to walk through. In three of them, including Yahad in Unum here, events cluster en masse over a base map. The base map is orientational, and as we'll see in a moment, it is indexical. The massing of dots gives one a sense of sheer numbers. It suggests the scale of terror and confinement for those who bring knowledge of the Holocaust to such a map. And by extension, they suggest the great numbers of people affected by the Holocaust, even though the dots here represent places. The visual massing of information in an opening map, however, collapses time and place. This approach presents the Holocaust as a fait accompli, with no alternative to the user but to dive down to the level of an individual person or place where some kind of story or explanation or sequence of events may lie. Here is a typical explanatory and enriched page of information in Yahad-Nunum. These sites provide no indication of how the major events that they represent unfolded over space and time. Similarly, the base maps that provide geographic orientation and a gateway to further information tell one really only about location and the geographic extent of events. Almost all other aspects of geography are mute. Now I'd like to move to campi fascisti. Am I saying that right, Alberto? Okay. The base maps are either almost invisible under the dots, as here the areas of interest are completely obscured, or the base maps are ahistorical, or both. Yahad-Nunum appears over an OpenStreetMap, I think, transports to extinction, uses screenshots of Google Earth satellite view with digital globe's signature stick pins, which are so 2000s. These qualities render the sites visually and spatially impoverished. Their richness lies a click or two away at the level of individual detail. In this website, when you click down, first you see in somewhat better view over a topographic map, though it is it is present day, where camps are located in a particular part of this site's interest, and then you go down to what most people are looking for, information about a particular place. Pop-ups, photographs, video insets, text boxes, or a neatly laid out page of discrete information such as we see here provide the site's most arresting content. But these elements lack context. Their association with places is tenuous or ignored almost entirely beyond the vague suggestion that they represent something important or intrinsic about the place. All of these sites are collections of information about single entities that the interface and the database behind it keep isolated from one another. You can see either all or only one individual person, one camp, one transport. Relating an individual story to the whole is left to the work of the viewer researcher. I would argue that this is true even for the sites that provide extensive textual histories, particularly Transports to Extinction and the Holocaust Atlas of Lithuania, which has some very long pages of information. One has to read and digest a textual history and then do all the work of trying to connect that information back to the map. I doubt anyone does this, which leaves the maps as merely indexical in a very thin way. Taken together, these characteristics atomize the Holocaust as much as Todd argued that the great encyclopedia projects do. Both forms immure knowledge, making it necessary to disaggregate it and transform it in order to show it in relationship to other entries, other examples, or other information that you want to bring into registration with what you're interested in. In other words, integration is impossible without a great deal more work. Now, leading proponents of the digital humanities and spatial humanities, including our dear Todd Presner, Joanna Drucker, David Bodenhammer, Trevor Harris, and many other spokespeople for the movements, have argued that fragmentation opens room for multiplicity. It gives more room for many voices. Further, in a more aesthetic mode, they argue that visual overlay or pastiche disrupts the illusion that places and history are static. What they want to show instead is that places are constantly undergoing transformation and reinterpretation from many angles by many people. Now, the Historical Geography Collaborative, I think it's fair to say, embraces the values of representing multiplicity, change, and differing perceptions. We admire projects that make hard-won historical research publicly available, but we also see a need for more analytical and interpretive digital scholarship and much more integrated scholarship. So this takes me to an effort, very briefly, to problematize our own Holocaust geovisualizations. First, I want to run through 5 examples from various projects, including a bit of new work that Erik has done with the VHA index. First, we have this map that is based on Paul's research and, excuse me, the cartography of Chester Harvey and Ben Blackshear of mapping plans of Auschwitz, what was planned and built, what was built and never planned, and so forth. This example from the Budapest project, I'll move on because you've learned a fair bit about that, but here we have residences as dots. This is one of Erik's maps based on testimony and other documents about evacuations from Auschwitz in the winter, January of 1945. Here is one of 2 maps that Erik has developed out of VHA Index, which the Shoah Foundation kindly has provided us, the location of camps in the index and the location of ghettos. We've just begun to work with some of this data. Now, what are the critiques of these kinds of visuals? I think they boil down to 2 basic concerns. First, that maps are abstractions. They are remote, they are cold, they are calculating. In fact, they reflect a calculative mentality. They are therefore dehumanizing in and of themselves. And secondly, a related notion, but it is, in terms of content and method, quite distinct, that maps are positivistic. Both of these critiques are leveled most strongly and consistently at maps produced with GIS, Geographic Information Systems, but I think they apply broadly to computer cartography. Now, Paul Jascott boldly declared last night, and I almost kissed him for it, that's on the tape now, isn't it, that abstraction is a fundamentally human mode of thinking and understanding. So I would like to throw out for discussion the critique that abstraction is in itself somehow dehumanizing. I don't think so, not necessarily. Do maps assert objectivity? Are they inherently positivistic? Again, I do not think so. This critique, which has been lively in geography for more than 30 years, is always, at least in part, actually a critique of aesthetics. This is something else that Paul has helped me realize. Hand-drawn maps, for example, almost never are criticized in these terms, even if they portray quantitative data, even if they are, in fact, highly positivistic in their content. They look human. So are we really worried about aesthetics here? A better understanding of the conventions and semantics and enormous expressive range of cartography and other modes of geovisualization would help us make much more nuanced critiques of maps. Do computer cartography and GIS raise or embody ethics that are somehow different from the ethics of texts? Again, I disagree with this proposition. I don't think that maps are any more prone to ethical danger or suspicion than any other form of representation, but they tend to draw it because they are unfamiliar and because their critics do not make maps and do not understand the conventions and the semantics and do not try to push or change those conventions or semantics of visual representation. And here I would refer you to an art historian I found inspiring to try to grapple with these questions, Barbara Stafford at the University of Chicago. I think she's now emerita, but she has written brilliantly about the privileging by historians and other humanists of texts and the lack of training and understanding and genuine critique of the visual. And lastly, I think the ethical charge, which we should all have in mind all the time, begins to sort of settle down if we show information in more than one way, if we explain our intentions, if we admit the limitations of our data, if we are transparent ourselves about our methodology. And that is certainly what our group tries to do, though it's a struggle, particularly because it gets in the way of a nice story. So, back to my list just for a moment. No, I didn't include it in this one, so that's okay. So what are some of the alternatives? 2 more minutes and I'm done. Work by hand, whether drawing on the computer or compiling images on the computer, such as this one, an image that Erik developed that really blew our minds near the end of our first phase of collaboration, when the GIS representation of evacuations had proved wholly inadequate to him and his colleagues. And he showed us this, and we said, yes, that's getting a whole lot closer to experience. Or get out the colored pencils and the paper. This is one of my students, Laura Strom's visualization of Leon Wells' testimony, using color to pick out his relative sense of freedom or confinement. Green is feeling free and being able to move voluntarily. Orange and red become more and more confined, and she's put along with it little excerpts from text. She calls them story bubbles of key moments in his testimony. And this is a working document, so let's work visually, not do it at the end, do it from the beginning to understand our material. Make a physical model. This is another student, Levi Westerveld's physical diagram of Agnes Adachi's testimony. Who comes in and out of the testimony? He used string and pins. While I was on my honeymoon, this is what he made. I couldn't have been happier. Or diagram the structure and content of your material. It is a computer-generated image, but first he drew it on paper, of the sort of accordion quality of time in testimony, that stories fill up, the important stories in testimony fill up a great deal of time. That's where the accordion expands, and then time collapses, and time moves very swiftly in fewer words. In other words, use visuals to help you think. And now I'll turn it over to Erik.
Keep clapping, because I need to switch the computers. Okay, thank you, Anne. That was lovely, and you covered most of what I wanted to say, so I think we're all set for the day. So as in Paul's words, I think I'm the visualizer that you wanted to be here. And Anne referenced a lot of work that I've done in the past and some of the critiques that we've given to it. Let's see, this is going to crash if I close it, so I'm going to...
Should we put this out of the way?
No, that's what I'm using, okay. So I think to pick up on some of Anne's kind of review of the positivist and objective nature of the critique that's been levied against cartographic objects as being highly objective, reductionist, positivist, I think can be aptly summarized by Edward Tufte, who has quite simply been the dominant voice in informing people how to do data visualization over the last 30 years. His work, the visual display of quantitative information in his four-part series, has really become the dominant at least popular source of instruction and information on how to do data visualization. And it draws from the scientific tradition that Anne referenced that really came out of the 60s and the positivist revolution in the work of Jacques Bertin, in the illustration of what a visual variable meant, how to map visual objects onto data, particularly quantitative data, and how that might be best done. Tufte summarizes this reductionist mindset in a quite simple formula, which is that you should not have any ink on your graphic that doesn't convey data very explicitly. And this formula itself quite reduces it to 1.0 minus the proportion of a graphic that can be erased without a loss of data information. in a sense, the perfect data visualization is one that only communicates the data and nothing more, and allows very little subjective interpretation. In a sense, the challenge of all of these types of data visualization is not so much what they are as aesthetic objects and how they represent the data, but it's the conversation that they engender with their audience. In a sense, the pure desire of the designer to create something that is fully reduced down to its essential data engenders a search for truth, not a search for confirmation, a search for critical examination or interpretation, but a search explicitly for the truth that the designer seeks to convey. And I would say what characterizes my career and my interest is figuring out a way to subvert this and identify ways to create visual objects that don't encourage people to seek truth, but to seek further engagement with the material and critical analysis. But of course, Yi-Fu Tuan, the father of humanist geography, the inventor, essentially, of the concept of place versus space, he himself recently wrote, "Maps do not generate frisson, a sense of the unknown, the unknowable, in short, a mystery," and calls out cartography for really failing to move beyond this objective form of presentation. So I think in that sense, I will bring up an example that is part of my work in collaboration with colleagues that really seeks to examine place in more depth, but still uses the syntax of cartography. This is a project focused on evaluating the emotions in fictional London, looking at several thousand novels published over a period of time, 1700 to 1900, and doing a large text mining approach in concert with a crowdsourcing approach to apply emotional valence to locations that are mentioned in novels that have place names in London, and show the evolution of that over time. So one of the critiques yesterday was a concept of time, representing place, representing emotion. This is what that is. This is the state of the art in cartographic practice of time, place, emotion, etc. And so what you see here is a valence of very fearful in red to very happy in green. It turned out all the other emotions were very difficult to convince Amazon Mechanical Turk users to tag. So the distinction between fearful and happy was about the simplest that we could use. And the result being that you get a map of London that shows the emotional valence of place as depicted in the fictional corpus. And you see that evolution over time. This, as I say, is the state of the art, which I use as sort of a straw man to say, this would be a well-respected, and this is, published New Left Review article. This is a kind of high-end, high-quality presentation of those dimensions. So I think, in contrast, our goals in the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative have been to really try to seek to move beyond these visual epistemologies, this visual syntax, which has such an emphasis on preserving that data-ink ratio from Tufte. In a sense, we're seeking an ontology of cartography, a visual epistemology of cartography that uses the epistemology of humanism. And we are nowhere near having an impact on this in the sense of moving forward the discussion in data visualization communities on what digital humanists can add to this conversation. I hope that some of our effort will move in that direction in the coming years. But in a sense, what we're seeking is the ability to still take advantage of the great power of mapping tools, as Todd enumerated yesterday, and we've seen enumerated, the ability for synthesis, comparison, change in scale, the viewing structures, patterns, seeing context, seeing the patterns of data that are there, but also the spaces that aren't there. These are testimonies of people's memories of the evacuation process from Auschwitz, which we could only identify places of absence of memory, absence of awareness by doing that mapping process. If you simply examine the text, you would not know what those spaces were if they even existed. How can we take advantage of these mapping methods, but still gain, harking back to some of the language we heard yesterday, how can we gain the subjective? How can we gain the relational? How can we gain the contingent? How can we be conscious of our framing? How can we honor and engender authenticity? How do we make wise images? And dynamism, texture. In a sense, our goal would be to create aesthetic objects. As Paul would remind us, these objects all need to be examined from their aesthetic standpoint, that engender not simply that search for truth, but see a phenomenon as subjective and contingent. And so the remaining examples I'll show are not related. Some of them are related to Holocaust, but go a little bit broader to explore some of these possibilities. Let's see if I can get this to run. Do we have? This would be just. Oops, sorry. Did not mean to do that. Just a brief video clip.
The novel Memórias Póstumas de Brás Cubas, published in Brazil in 1881, is probably the most famous work by Brazil's most esteemed author, Machado de Assis. In this visualization, the characters and places referred to in the novel are animated in sequence and shown in relation to one another and the physical space of Rio de Janeiro in the 19th century. The purpose of this visualization is to bring the space of social networks in the novel Memórias Póstumas into the same frame of reference as the space of the city of Rio de Janeiro, where most of the action in the novel takes place. At the top of the frame, hovering over a map of the city, the connections among characters in the novel are graphed according to a network algorithm. Because novels unfold in time and space, we show the active nodes of the network and their connection to the physical space of the city. In this way, the fictional universe of relationships is shown to be constructed over time through a series of encounters.
Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to close it all together. So that continues on, but you get the idea. So it's a social network in relation to a spatial network, and it has a temporality to it, and it's also fictional. It's created through this novel, and so considering this as a possible aspirational mode to be able to combine social, relational, and space and time all together into a single visualization that is not presented in a static form, but allows you to engage with it interactively. I just have a few more minutes here, and I want to jump over to this example that picks up on some of Alberto's work on the Budapest ghetto. This is another effort to bring in dynamism, bring in our awareness of the complexities of these patterns. And so this project is actually a simulation of the landscape of the Budapest ghetto with an emphasis on the movement of pedestrians between their homes and the market halls. In a sense, this is an animated version of the graphic that Alberto showed yesterday, which showed the kind of range of individuals being able to walk in the city during certain amounts of time. So we began really with this static map of the yellow star houses and then the blue are the market halls. And what this visualization does is simulate the process of people moving throughout the city. And what's interesting about it is that it is truly speculative
short period of time
in the sense that we don't know exact routes that people would take, but we know that it was a hurried process given the curfew. And so being able to move from that broad sense of the distribution of individuals to those market halls, GIS can facilitate a network analysis that will identify the process of people moving through that space in an animated fashion. And so what you see in this visualization is data that we didn't have before. We've actually created new data to allow people to analyze what streets may have been significant, what areas may there have been more vulnerability, less vulnerability, more visibility. And because we want this tool to be less definitive and truth-seeking, we really encourage people to modify the simulation. So being able to modify what time of day they departed, being able to change walking speeds, the amount of time they spent shopping, and also the variation, which is important dimension here. The purpose of these ability to modify these is really to bracket the uncertainties, because a lot of people look at something like this and they say, oh, well, who knows how fast they walked, or who knows, you have no idea that this is the case. But actually, you do have some range of uncertainty. And that's what these sliders are, is to say, this is someone walking incredibly slow. This is someone running. And in that range, you have that ability to modify. So we should seek to move past that simple idea that if you have uncertainty, you can't represent these objects. And so changing the model creates an entirely different visualization. The last example I'll show is a nod to the conversation about Mikecz, which is really to consider the virtual. This project is really this is a project about a historical reconstruction of a present-day space. This is a reservoir outside Stanford University that has a dam that's failing. It also has a lawsuit against Stanford considering the challenges of salmon passage through this stream. And so there's a consideration now to remove it. Question is what happens if you remove the dam and this reservoir is drained? What happens to this now sensitive wetland landscape that has developed over the last 100 years? And so one of the ways to examine this question is a historical reconstruction. What did this landscape look like before the dam? And to move into an interpretive mode that allows us to be in that landscape and examine that landscape as an ecology. And so the effort on this project was to do a whole lot of quantitative analysis to do a suitability interpretation of which species might appear in different areas, depending on the different fluctuations in Native American burning, fluctuations in our interpretation of climate change, fluctuations in different interaction between species, and create a version of this that takes us back to roughly the year 1800. And so what you see in this is it's basically a static image that I'm showing you, although I'm animating across the screen. But this truly is a three-dimensional virtual world in which each of these trees is being grown by an algorithm, the software that's used to make films like Avatar. This is the software. And so these trees are being grown each time you run it. They're not static objects. They're actually being formulaically built each time. And the relationships between objects in that space are generated through your definitions of species relations. And so this is an effort to cross that uncanny valley, so to speak, that we have with Mikecz, and to really engender the idea of experiential interpretation. And so what we're looking at here is a kind of speculative, what if this happened? This could be a future landscape. We're looking at something that engages people in that mode of conversation and really stimulates that sensory experience rather than kind of trying to summarize it for people. So I'm out of time. I'll end there. But I think there's a lot of opportunities here for us to move beyond.
Thank you, Erik and Ann. We'll just take like 10 minutes for questions because those presentations were a little long. And then maybe at the end we'll have more chance to ask the two presenters some questions. So.
Hi. I'm Barbara Mulvaney, and I prosecuted the Rwandan genocide. So we're sort of sitting here watching all these great tools you all have that we did not have. And the mapping is so personal to me because when I got there, there were no maps. And that was 2002, and we had a huge database. So we had to sort of crawl through storage units to try to find a map and take them up to Belgium and get them copied. But maps were super important. And we also did a lot of hand-drawn maps, which were invaluable. But I see all the tools, not only your tools today, but the tools yesterday, and we had none of that. And we still are looking for tools to help us analyze what we have. This is a conference on digital approaches to genocide studies, not just Holocaust studies. And so I'm sort of hoping that out of all of this, we can find people that have the desire to sort of look outside what you're doing now and take on new projects. So thank you. And I love your maps. I mean, we have 800,000 dead within 100 days all over the country. And so how things fit together were always so important. And until we started doing the maps, we couldn't tell where the genocideers were, like where their offices were. It was very planned. When you look at it from far away, it looks like not a mess, but very undefinable. When you look at it very specifically down to the person, you see the patterns. And that's why it's always been so important for me to look at all the genocides together, because what is important are the patterns of the different genocides. Yes. The planning, the arming, the media, and all those things. So I really appreciate your work.
Where are you based?
Right now in D.C.
Are you with an academic institution?
No, it's a law firm.
Right.
I'm a war crimes prosecutor. I worked for the UN. I retired from the UN. I'm also State Department. And right now we're helping the Rwandan people work out their databases. So we're here very excited to see everything you're doing. We can't do a pinchas, or we can't do an embodied database. We have a whole different set of problems.
George Washington University has a wonderful geography department. They have graduate students. They all learn GIS. That would be my first suggestion.
Okay, other questions?
Can I do a follow-up? I worked a few years ago with a student from Hillary, the one in Canada, Hillary Earl, on the Rwandan genocide. And we didn't conclude anything because she dropped out of school. But I actually volunteered to work with you and talk about this because it's always been something that I started and I never finished. Sorry.
Okay, other questions? Gabor?
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I'm coming from Budapest. I know very well the stories about Budapest during the war, but still I'm a bit puzzled by your simulation because I don't understand what's the purpose here. What's the thing that we will understand following a simulation like this about Budapest, about the ghettoization in Budapest, and so on? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. If I could characterize the purpose in very vague terms initially, and then maybe we could dive into more of the content. The purpose in vague terms is to engage people beyond the specificity of the home itself, and to examine the dynamic nature of the ghetto in the space. It's a dispersed ghetto. What does it mean to have a dispersed ghetto? What is the relationship between the policies of spatial aggregation and temporal aggregation, and how does that play out in the landscape of the city? I think specifically the project was interested in the question of visibility. And so when you look at visibility at the scale of the city and the Yellow Star houses, you get a very different picture than you see halfway through that animation. Visibility is very concentrated, and certain streets have highly visible populations on them. So those are some basic things you can learn, but I think most importantly it's a tool, that you're engaging with, there's a high interactivity to it. And so as a researcher, you can ask your own questions seeing that animation.
Can I, very small addendum, something we talked about in the group when this visualization came out of Erik's shop was that such work might help one fill the enormous gap in bystander studies, that bystander evidence is so scarce. So this kind of tool in particular could help one at least imagine and ask questions and then look for additional documentation in that topic.
We have time just for a couple more questions. So.
Yeah, this actually builds on what is a fantastic panel. I was thinking at the maps that you showed, I didn't see any dots though on the Danube River, and thinking about the river as a space of where I was thinking of Agnes's testimony, which you brought up, and when she dives into the river to save other Jews who had been thrown into the river, which was common practice, and the Danube Exodus, a film that Peter Forgage made, and then there's the Labyrinth project that was done here at USC, looking at kind of trajectories through the river. And I was just wondering if, and that is really crucial because it's about reconstructing perspectives not only on the land, but also in the water. And I'm curious if you could...
Someone should do it.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, just quickly, Anne, I was interested in your list of the ways of seeing, right? Seeing, showing, and so on and so forth. One thing you didn't mention in that list, of course, was seeing as domination and control. And I'm thinking about it in terms of what Charles Taylor talks about as the politics of recognition, which is like who you see, how you see them can be both affirming and degrading, depending, right? So I just wondered if you had either of you had any thoughts on that aspect of seeing and how it connects to the practice of cartography.
Sorry.
Actually, and secondly, I wondered if how self-reflexive maps can finally be, and specifically if maps can actually acknowledge what they can't show.
And thus, on the second point, maps cannot self-reflect, people can. So people should reflect about their maps. Thank you very much. That definitely belongs on the list, probably as the first thing or the second thing. What you have articulated there, seeing as domination and control, is the essence of Brian Harley's argument and the whole critique of cartography that developed in the late 1980s and through the 1990s and is still dominant in cultural geography of maps as tools of power, the handmaiden of empire, and so forth. So thank you. That definitely belongs.
Okay, I'll take two quick questions. Make them quick together, and then quick answers. All right?
I loved it. Thank you very much. It did, though. I was interested in both of you that the real problem you seem to be stuck with was the temporal dimension. So I wonder if you could talk about, is the temporal dimension the real problem in terms of visualizing spatial experience?
Yes, I wanted just to go on this discussion of the map of Budapest and the way up to the market halls. I think the very important point of this work is if we're talking about the experiences of persecution in the city, which is understudied in my opinion. I'm not promoting for my paper later. This really helps thinking about that. I mean, to frame testimonies, what we know about it, and this is very important.
What more is there to say? Yes, it's very important.
Is it the real nut of visualization? Is the temporal?
Oh, there are lots of nuts.
No, I mean, what I didn't talk significantly about was place, and to get to Alberto's question yesterday, can you have a place-based GIS, which is not so much about temporality, it's about texture, and so I think the nod to the virtual at the end, the emphasis there is not so much on our ability to create such things, but it's actually a combination of the quantitative analysis that goes into creating something like that, which is highly analytical, with a kind of representation that energizes notions of meaning and significance. I know to this audience, the kind of representation of ecology may not elicit feelings of meaning, but I think that's an essential piece that we didn't emphasize as much. Yes. The best part.
Okay, thank you, Anne and Erik, for a fascinating presentation. Again, if anybody else had questions, we might airline Sturdy Colls. She is currently the professor of conflict archaeology and genocide investigation at Staffordshire University, specializing in Holocaust studies. Her research is interdisciplinary, looking at a study of Holocaust landscapes with a particular focus on forensic and archaeological techniques and the ethical issues that surround their implementation. She has undertaken archaeological fieldwork at the Treblinka extermination and labor camps in Poland, as well as other Holocaust sites in Germany, Serbia, the Ukraine, and the Channel Islands. Are those all Holocaust sites? Okay, just checking. In 2016, she was awarded the prestigious European Archaeological Heritage Prize. She is author of numerous publications on Holocaust archaeology and missing persons investigations at sites of mass violence. Her recent monographs include Holocaust Archaeologies and the Handbook of Missing Persons. Today she's going to present Imagining the Unimaginable, Archeologically-Derived Visualizations of Holocaust Landscapes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the organisers for flying me here from the United Kingdom to speak to you today about my work in archaeology and the Holocaust, which now has spanned the last decade. Essentially, what I'd like to do today is to give you very much an introduction to some of the projects that we've been working on at the Centre of Archaeology at Staffordshire University, to give you an idea of some of the visualisations that we've created, some of the reasons why we've done that, and some of the new spatial and temporal insights that I very strongly believe that archaeology and interdisciplinary approaches can add to our knowledge of this period. Obviously, over the last decade, as I said, I've been working in this area, but other archaeologists too have been starting to investigate landscapes of the Holocaust. Many have focused on traditional methods of excavation. Our team, however, has chosen to focus on a slightly different approach, although as I'll show you, we do excavate as well, in that we've drawn on the wide range of what we call non-invasive techniques that can be used to visualize landscapes. And I'll explain in the presentation something about those types of methods. So it's very important to say that, as I say, I am an archaeologist by training, but my projects are very much interdisciplinary in that I draw upon, along with my team, methods in history, forensic investigation, policing, engineering, computing, geography, and a wide range of other aspects of digital and social sciences. And very much the core of my research, not least of all because of the fact that many previous excavations of archaeological sites have caused general upset amongst many communities, is that I want to investigate sites of the Holocaust in a way that, of course, derives their historic and scientific potential, but in a way that respects their religious and commemorative significance. And so, as a predecessor to any field work that we do, one of the big undertakings that I ensure that I do is to visit the communities that will be affected by our work, to find out in particular the different religious groups, but also the other communities and individuals that will be affected by our work. And one of the reasons we developed the non-invasive approach that I mentioned at many sites is because that in many, many cases, it is not permitted or wanted to excavate in Holocaust landscapes. Sometimes where we have the remains of Jewish victims buried in mass graves, for example, this is because Jewish halakhic law stipulates that human remains buried in a grave should not be disturbed. That's very much an oversimplification. I am willing to come back to that in the questions, but in essence, many rabbinical authorities will not permit excavation. But for other religious groups and for other non-denominational communities, the simple fact that these sites are sites of mass atrocity and that they're seen as sacred spaces means that digging in the ground is seen as metaphorically and physically disturbing these important sites. So if we want to derive information about the physical traces that exist of the crimes, in order to understand the victims and perpetrator and bystander experiences, we have to look for other methods. If we're not allowed to dig, what else can we do? And that was the big question that I posed first as part of my master's and then as part of my PhD research, and it remains at the heart of what we do. So I developed a methodology that draws upon multiple methods. Not all of these techniques will be applied at every site, I should say. We select the methods based upon the particular circumstances of the landscapes that we're investigating, so the types of terrain, the types of research questions that we're posing, the time available, and other logistical issues. But these are all options for us. So again, I start right back at the beginning. I always go back and research in the archives. I always try and find as many documents, letters, photographs, audiovisual materials, and the like as possible. Because as an archaeologist, just like the Holocaust Geographies team, I'm asking slightly different questions than perhaps a traditional historian would, in that I'm interested in people's experiences of places. I'm interested in the clues hidden within testimonies about where mass graves might be located, or where buildings were, what people could see from particular places within a camp, for example. So I reevaluate this material in order to check that this kind of information hasn't been overlooked. And where possible, I do go back and interview survivors as well to ask them the same questions. I always collate as many maps, photographs, satellite imagery, aerial imagery from the time and since as possible, essentially building layer upon layer of visual information about how the site looks now, how the site looked at the time when the crimes were perpetrated, and everything in between. Because when we finally do hopefully find that physical evidence in the landscape, we need to understand the period to which that evidence relates, and it helps us characterize our findings. Because my background is in forensic archaeology and missing persons investigation, I'm also very interested in the way that we can use forensic search techniques within the landscape, looking at subtle changes like vegetation change, depressions in the ground, which may indicate the presence of buried remains. And sometimes I do that visually in the field. Sometimes I use techniques like airborne LiDAR, which is a laser scanning methodology which allows you to create digital terrain models of the landscape that shows up those subtle depressions that I mentioned. And I'll come back to that shortly. Moving into the field, again, I'm going to whiz through these, but I'll come back to them with the case studies. We use a wide range of methods to map physical traces that we can see on the surface. And we also use a suite of methods called geophysical techniques, which allow us to see beneath the ground, to map anomalies, buried remains beneath the ground. These are not X-ray machines. They just show you that there are different types of buried material, and it's through comparison with archive material through aerial imaging, again, that layering in GIS systems that enable us to build up a detailed picture of the landscape. And we also have started very recently as well, I'll say very recently, the last 5 years, to use a wide range of methods from terrestrial laser scanning and photogrammetry to document above ground remains in high definition as well. And so the benefits of this approach, I think there are many benefits. One is, of course, that it caters for the ethical needs that I already mentioned. But the application of these non-invasive methods allows us to do essentially three things. Firstly, it enables us to document above-ground remains that survive within Holocaust landscapes, and even where significant development has taken place, where memorials have been constructed, where sites have changed. As an archaeologist, we are trained. It's our very essence to search for these physical traces that others may not see. So we're mapping these sites, and we're documenting them, and we're preserving them by way of record, in the sense as we are recording them as they exist on the day we do the survey. Many of these methods document the sites, but they will also reveal, as I already mentioned, these subtle traces, be they above ground or below the ground. So these methods also help us to locate and identify new evidence that in many cases have laid hidden for many years. And as a byproduct of this, but a very, very important part of the work that we do, we create visualizations, we create data sets that we very strongly believe should be used to disseminate our findings. As I'll come on to with the case studies, the societal impact of our work, the way that it is responded to by the public, there's a lot of public interest in what we do, and we very much feel we have a responsibility to reciprocate by making our information available to the public as well. So I'll start with a few examples, firstly on the very much the macro scale. So we've worked at a number of sites where the physical traces of Holocaust sites do actually survive, sometimes almost completely, albeit modified in the landscape. So in 2013, we did a survey of Staffordshire in Serbia, which is the first concentration camp where the gas vans were used. And we documented the buildings of that camp, which still survive in the landscape today and which have been used for various purposes since the war. And these visualizations, as I said, gave us a record of how that camp looked on the day we did the survey. but also from a cultural memory perspective, we can read these three-dimensional models as a representation of all the political, social changes that have occurred in the years since the war, since many of these spaces have been used for various, what you could say as some inappropriate, some more appropriate purposes. So this project was actually called Living Death Camps because it was looking at the afterlife of these structures. And in 2015, we were asked by the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation to undertake a similar survey at Bergen-Belsen. Now, of course, Bergen-Belsen, the camp itself was burnt down by the British Army, and no traces, no obvious traces, I should say, of the camp survived. But they wanted to create a documentary, three-dimensional visual record of how the memorial looked at that moment. And again, because we'd done this in high definition, we did drone survey, we did laser scanning survey, and then we used ground penetrating radar to look for the remnants of selected buildings such as the crematorium, barrack foundations, and unmarked mass graves in this terrain. We created both a record of how the site looked at the time, we identified new features within the landscape, and similarly, we've now created something that can be very much used as an educational tool. And I'll just very quickly show you a short video which illustrates just one very simple visualization that we did. It's not coming up on the screen. Technical assistance. I have to drag it. Okay. Thank you. Great. Oh, it's kind of huge now.
Do you want me to help you?
Broken it. Yes,
No.
So just while that's loading up, this will form part of a BBC documentary, which will also include newly recorded testimonies that the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation have also recorded to juxtapose survivor stories with the new technology that we've created. Yeah, that should
Fine.
Just scroll.
Go back.
Yeah, will you type in the password?
Not quite, although maybe I'll change it to that. Okay.
So just scroll down that tiny bit, and then you'll see this. Exactly, this thing popped up.
Okay, so this is a high definition point cloud. So all of this data can be interrogated, it can be rendered. What you're seeing there is the below ground scans from the ground penetrating radar, which we've overlaid. So you can essentially, this is an animation of course, but if you had the three-dimensional model in front of you, you would be able to navigate from the air through to the modern ground terrain and then through to the buried remains beneath. And as I say, we are working on animating that, embellishing it with testimonies, and that will be a project which we will be working on over the next sort of 12 months. I broke it again. So with the presentations about technology, but the technology doesn't work.
Just minimize it.
If you just start this up, I think it'll probably overwrite it.
She has another film on.
It's okay, yeah.
You'll have to do it again, the same.
I'll just click on the link.
Okay.
From current slide.
Okay. All right. Okay, so as was mentioned in the introduction, one of the sites where I've been working now since, I've been working on this since 2007, but doing fieldwork really at Treblinka since 2010. Everybody in this room, of course, will be familiar with Treblinka, the extermination camp, where it's estimated that between 800,000 and 1 million people were murdered. And of course, the history of the extermination camp is very well documented. But in those same historical narratives, common themes come up time and time again, which is that the Nazis were capable of destroying all of the evidence, that they literally destroyed the remains of the victims, that they cremated the victims, that they hid their remains, that they demolished all of the buildings when they abandoned the site towards the end of 1943. And that no traces of the camp survived. And that was something that was also reiterated even after forensic investigations were carried out in the 1940s. So I wanted to challenge that. As an archaeologist, I knew that a crime of that scale simply could not leave no physical trace. So as I'll come on to shortly, we've used a wide range of methods to try and find that buried and hidden evidence. And Treblinka extermination camp, if you go there today, again, there is no visible traces above the ground that are obvious, and it is now a memorial landscape. Few people will probably be familiar with the fact that there was also a labour camp at Treblinka, where around 10,000 people were murdered through a combination of poor living and working conditions, but also systematic executions. And that camp was actually built in 1941, a year before the extermination camp was constructed, and continued to operate for almost a year after the extermination camp closed down. So Treblinka's landscape is much more complex. It also included an execution site where people were brought from Warsaw and other surrounding areas and killed, and where labour camp victims were also shot and buried in mass graves. So just to give you some, there's so many findings from this, I can't of course talk about them all, but I just wanted to give you some examples that I think perhaps link best to the themes of this conference. So starting with the labour camp, one of the first things that we did here was to walk the terrain to identify the traces of the structures that did survive above the ground in the first instance, identify the locations of the camp boundaries, and map those using equipment like total stations and GPS systems, very similar to what you see people using when they're mapping roads and other construction sites. And so what you're seeing on the left-hand side here is our essentially our plan that we created of those traces that we could see above the ground, and other subtle changes in vegetation which may indicate the presence of other structures overlaid onto a 1944 aerial photograph. And at the labour camp, ironically, a lot of evidence does survive below the ground, but the number of visitors who goes to this site is significantly less. And I'm very often asked by people at the extermination camp, is it worth visiting the labour camp? So read into that what you will. So the result of our mapping project is that we've created the first accurate map of the labour camp using our in-field investigation and comparison to aerial photographs. And I should say that we've created multiple maps that demonstrate the temporal changes to the camp over time as well, recognising it as very much as a dynamic landscape. We've also used photogrammetry techniques to map in 3D the remains of these structures that do still survive. So what you're seeing here is the cellar behind the kitchen, just one example, but there are many other structures as well that are in a terrible state of disrepair. So these models serve as both, again, preservation by record, hopefully an inspiration for conservation, but they can also be, as we will be doing, brought into a digital platform where each one of those barrack foundations on our map can then be accessed in terms of seeing the visual models that we've created alongside other materials. And I'll come on to those shortly. Several of the buildings in the labour camp didn't exist above the ground, and there was lots of misinformation. There were very basic markers in the terrain of the labour camp indicating what certain buildings were, which we very quickly found to be incorrect after our analysis of the aerial images. So we wanted to identify every single building, the location of every single building. So we used, again, ground-penetrating radar to find the foundations of one of the barrack buildings in the main prisoner area, which was at least part of it was the barrack for the sick. And I wanted to put this slide in because I think this illustrates a very important point about our work. Of course, we are mapping these sites. Of course, we are undertaking a scientific process. But as I said at the beginning, archaeology is about people. We encounter survivors, we encounter people who experience these places through our work, and we very much wanted to make sure that this doesn't just become a scientific form of documentation, that it is actually always linked to the people who experience these places. So for us, the discovery of buildings like this is important because not only does it create a historically accurate record of the site, but it also enables us to link this information with survivor testimonies and other documentary evidence to show what life was like in the camp. And also, obviously, this mapping process allowed us to comment on things like segregation of prisoners who were separated by race, religion, and perceived skill sets within this camp. And many of the buildings that people were living in had a huge impact upon their chances of survival. For example, in this building, people said that if they ended up in this place, that it was basically certain death. They refer here to it was a vestibule to the crematorium because they believed they'd be sent to the nearby extermination camp crematorium. The reality actually was that they would be more likely to be executed and buried in the mass graves south of the camp. But even so, for the survivors in this camp, many of the testimonies talk about the importance of architecture and their experiences. So what we were able to do in the first instance, in I guess you'd say an analog kind of way, was that we created 43 new information panels on every single one of the structures and boundaries that we found within the labour camp itself. And these panels deliberately bring together survivor voices, aerial images, data that we've collected, documents and factual information revising the narratives of these sites so that visitors now have a much more hopefully enriched experience. And we have noticed this has had a big impact upon people taking the time to visit this site, particularly following commemorative ceremonies. And even should have put it in, but I had an amazing photo where we hadn't even put the signs up yet, but people were kind of trying to read them like this as they were walking around, which was really great for us to see. And we're now working on digitizing this. As I mentioned, we're now working on pulling this into a digital platform. Okay, so just to finish with a couple of comments about Treblinka extermination camp area and our biggest discoveries there, if I may, which hopefully will then lead on to a discussion about some broader issues. We found many things at Treblinka. We've mapped the locations of the boundaries, the guard towers, many of the structures, and many of the mass graves in the area. But I guess our key finding is the location of the first gas chamber building that was built at the site. And this example, I think, shows the various processes that we go through, the stages that we've been through with the different data sets. So we first of all in 2010 carried out a ground penetrating radar survey area. Having reviewed witness testimonies, even though the museum and all the tour guides said that the gas chambers were likely to be under the current memorial obelisk, we realised they must have been further into the camp area. So we did our ground penetrating radar survey, and again, the testimonies tell us that the only buildings in the death camp area were built of brick, and when we came across these foundations and scattered bricks on the surface in the ground penetrating radar data that you can see at the bottom there, obviously that started alarm bells ringing. We subsequently followed up with an airborne LiDAR survey, which showed very significant depressions in the same area. And so because we'd taken this ethical approach to the investigation of the site using these non-invasive methods, the rabbinical authorities actually gave us permission to carry out some small-scale excavations in 2013. And when we did this, we just dug a 1 by 1 metre trench. We uncovered at a metre deep the foundations of the old gas chamber building, sections of brick walling, the tiles that you see here, as well as a number of personal objects. And again, the testimonies perfectly describe the types of tiles that we were finding. So we're building up a very detailed picture of the architecture of the gas chambers. And in the process of doing this, we forensically document everything that we do. So with photogrammetry, we've documented the trenches we've excavated layer by layer. We've drawn maps, we've drawn plans. We've taken three-dimensional, 360-degree photographs of all of the objects. And we intend to initiate a scanning program to scan those individual objects next year as well, again, to build them into a digital database. So we're very also conscious that we want to show the public and of course our fellow academics, how we go about this process, how we are rigorously investigating these forensic, in a forensic sense. So just as a final slide, I'd just like to say, of course, this work is not without its challenges. As I've already mentioned, the ethical issues that you encounter in this work are many, and the responsibility, if you like, and the ethical issues that emerge when presenting this work to the public are perhaps even more complex. So in 2013, we actually made a film about the work that we did at Treblinka, which again included other visualizations. We did an exhibition. We've had artists responding to the findings. The film was incredibly well received. We've had over 10 million views worldwide of the film. It was shown in the US on Smithsonian and also in the United Kingdom. But of course, it's also elicited a huge response from Holocaust deniers who actually have made a counter film and dissected every sentence that I said in this movie. And if you're bored on a Sunday afternoon, Googling me is quite entertaining. There are some incredible websites about this project, but also about me by Holocaust deniers. And so I guess that shows that, of course, when we do this work, we also have to think we may elicit those kinds of responses from the public and be prepared for them as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I did a little background research before hosting this, and I did find Caroline's name online. She was called a fraud, I think. So I have much sympathy for what you have to deal with. Questions? And I want to get the sides of the room. Anybody over here?
Caroline, I have two questions. So the first question is about Jankel Wiernik and his model of Treblinka. You never mentioned it. So if you could comment on the worth of his model and the later two models that were based on his model. I mean, are they just like an imagination of something? Or so that's the first question. And the second question is, I don't know if you were involved in the excavation in Bergen-Belsen, but at this new museum, many objects are kind of partly hidden, but also shown in the floor. There are glass cases with these objects. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jankel Wiernik, obviously his testimony is incredibly detailed. As somebody one of the few people who had first-hand experience of the gas chambers, his work was absolutely instrumental in the interpretation of our findings. So, for example, when we discovered the foundations of what we believe to be the old gas chambers, the dimensions of that being 22 meters by 15 meters are incredibly similar to the dimensions that Jankel Wiernik describes in his testimony. And then, of course, he subsequently went on to build his model. Obviously, you will know this, you've seen his model. It's a different shape than the actual terrain of the camp. But in terms of the detail that he places into the buildings, many of those things we have found to be accurate. So it's very interesting to compare these different maps. There are many, many, many maps of Treblinka that were drawn by survivors. Some, of course, are more detailed than others. Some, as I said, are completely the wrong shape, but in a particular area where those particular individuals really experience those buildings, the detail that they place in terms of the architectural drawings of those individual structures is incredible. So essentially what we've had to do is go through each of those maps, evaluating the areas that those individuals are the most likely to have experienced, and therefore evaluate, if you like, the reliability of each section of those individual maps. And as for your second question, no, I wasn't involved in the excavations at Bergen-Belsen. There's an archaeologist who's been working there for, I think, close to 15 years with the Bergen-Belsen team, and they were involved in those excavations in the terrain to recover the objects that you see in the museum. The remit of our project was, as I mentioned, more to create this visualization of what the site looked like now, and to essentially create a record that hopefully in the longer term will also be used in the new learning centre, which actually today they've chosen, the UK government have chosen the design for that learning centre today. They just announced it this morning, and that was one of the purposes of the model. Thanks.
Caroline, it's marvelous and inspiring work, but it also inspires questions, of course. I saw a presentation about 1.5 years ago in Vilnius by two archaeologists. I've forgotten their names, but they're doing pro bono work with Yahadinunum to use non-invasive techniques for documentation. Pro bono work is lovely, but your presentation suggests this must be enormously expensive work to undertake. So I'm curious, I don't necessarily want dollar figures, but how costly is this, and therefore how extensible is it to other sites? And then perhaps related question, what nerve are you touching that makes the work so powerful for people and inspires deniers?
Thank you. Great questions. Okay, as for the first question, I probably ought to get a better answer to this because I think it's my most commonly asked question. Actually, a lot of the work, I mean, when we first started doing this, I mean, as I mentioned, Treblinka was part of my master's and my PhD project, and I should at this point use the opportunity to acknowledge the fact my husband is also here. In the beginning, it was literally me and him going and doing this work, on our own, kind of recruiting our friends, family to come and help us. And so the real challenge with this work is having the equipment to do it and having the kind of technical knowledge, which of course takes a lot of time. And of course the laser scanning and the visualization work where you're dealing with huge data sets, of course that's it is expensive. However, it's probably not as expensive as you think. I'm trying to think of Kevin, you're the money man. What's a good example that I can give of something that we did recently?
Well,
the Belsen visualization, that wasn't all that expensive, was it? I think it's a case of trying to convince people to do this type of work for a discounted rate given the subject. So we always try to get reduced rates, but also it's a case of people recognise the chance to develop their own skills in this area. So a lot of the people who we get on our projects don't necessarily specialise in Holocaust investigations. They come at archaeology from a completely different discipline, and they help us out and they work with us because they see the value of this work. So actually, it's not too expensive, but we have received funding more recently, so it does allow us to perhaps do more detailed investigations at some of these sites rather than just myself and Caroline going on the weekends and doing it. So we have got more lucky recently, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I mean, probably the most expensive example of what we did there, the LiDAR survey that I showed you of Treblinka, which is about just shy of 4 square kilometres. That cost £18,000, which is about $25,000, something like that, to do that survey and to have that data processed to a point where we could look at it and utilise it and that kind of thing. Actually, the rest of it is really, it comes down to manpower hours in terms of sending people out to sites. So it probably looks more expensive than it is. Is probably the answer. As to the second question, I think the only way that I can comment on what really touches a nerve with the public is from the emails I receive, actually. And a lot of people, I think, particularly with the film, I think what was really interesting about the film was that a lot of people were commenting on the way that the film was made and the way that they felt the team handled the ethical sensitivities. So I think a lot of people, it's about the science, but it's also about the approach. And it's wonderful for me to receive those kinds of emails, obviously from people saying thank you for the work. And some of those people have got relatives, some who died at Treblinka or other Holocaust sites. Some of them absolutely don't. And it's also, I find it's really fascinating, actually, that people will share something of their story as well, even if their story is not connected to the Holocaust, in that they send me a picture of their grandkids or pictures of their dog and things like that. And it's wonderful. I mean, credit to the film company that made the film as well, from that perspective, that it obviously has allowed that to connect really with the public. As for the deniers, I think it's several-fold. I think some of it is obviously because we're going through this forensic process, we're collecting data. They kind of break that apart. They like to kind of break down everything. I mean, my first encounter with them, there was a couple of minute video that we'd done as a taster video for a TV documentary that was actually on a password protected site, and the password lapsed for something like, I think 3 hours, was it, in the middle of the night, and somehow they got it, they analysed every sentence that I said, and that's what kind of sparked the whole thing. And so I think that's part of it. I would also say that part of it is possibly also me, in the sense that I think they're not used to probably seeing, particularly at that time, a young woman doing this kind of work. And again, if you've Googled me, there's some bizarre websites about me and my motivations, and I think that seems to have captured their attention as well. So, yeah, that's probably a reasonable summary.
Still have a little time. Any more questions? Okay, we'll start the next one.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our final president, professor in history at Washington University in St. Louis. She was educated at the University of Oldenburg in Germany and the State University of St. Petersburg in Russia before receiving her PhD at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research and teaching interests include World War II and Nazi genocide, migration, nationality, politics, and oral history in the former Soviet Union in Europe. Her recent book, Pioneers and Partisans, An Oral History of Nazi Genocide in Belarus, weaves together oral histories, video testimonies, and memoirs to show how the first generation of Soviet Jews experienced the Nazi genocide and how they remember it after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Currently, she's studying the long aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II with a particular focus on how people remembered and lived with effects and repercussions of systematic violence in Belarus. Her talk today is titled Visualizing the Holocaust in Belarus, Communal Experiences and Memories of Genocide.
Thank you, Jeremy, for this introduction, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me here after working with Testimonies of the Shoah Foundation Institute for almost 8 years. It's very nice to come here and kind of bring some of the work back. You will notice that some of the things I'm going to say kind of echo things from Anne and Erik's presentation, but in some ways also issues that Caroline has addressed. But afraid my digital work is a little bit more pedestrian in some ways. But I hope it will stimulate at least a good discussion. So I've studied the history of the genocide of Soviet Jewry in Belarus for several years. And over time, I became increasingly interested and sensitive to the question, what does it actually mean to live on, near, or even sometimes on mass graves, which in Belarus are very, very ubiquitous, often very close to towns. But often also you can read media reports in Belarus that new buildings are being built and bones are found in the ground. And often it turns out that these were killing sites during the German occupation. So in many ways, mass graves, killing sites are very, very present. So I'm interested in how these places of mass murder are remembered, how people relate to them. With the purpose of investigating that question, I've recently visited a number of smaller towns and villages in Belarus, for instance, Beshankovichi, to look at these places, assess their location, but also their proximity to or distance from places of settlement, but also to ask people about their relationships to these sites. And to my mind, these are both intrinsically historical but also geographical questions, since on one hand they focus on how people understand the world around them, how this changes over time, how it is impacted by historical change, but it also concerns spatial relationships and relationships between different locales. And importantly, of course, to explore how the history and memory of Jewish lives and the Holocaust are inscribed in the landscapes, I think is geography par excellence, because the term geography actually combines earth and writing. So in addition to using oral histories, video testimonies from the Shoah Foundation, but also Yad in Unum, for instance, my own photographs, archival documentations, and kind of field notes, so very typical material for historical and ethnographic research. I've also used or explored the utility of visualization, a method that we've already seen multiple times. Is very often used in geographical approaches in thinking about spatial relationships. So for me, visuality and visualization are very central for this inquiry, of course, in two ways. On one hand, the notion of seeing and representing a set of information in the form of an image as a form of discovery and interpretation is one, but the creation of a mental image, another way in which we can understand visualization, is just as important. So in this vein, I, to some extent, pursued what Knowles and others have discussed as inductive visualization, making things visible to detect and think about topological or spatial relationships. And given that my central question is how people relate to particular places, I, of course, paid particular attention to the role of spatial distance and proximity. And in that sense, my efforts centered very much on mapping these elements, meaning visualizing perspectives, distances, and relations. And creating this visual account has enabled me to see things I hadn't really been able to pinpoint up until then, namely a divided geography of memory. And that is very much facilitated by the geography of the historical experience itself. But it also gave rise to a construction of what Edward Said had once called an imaginative geography, and I can talk a bit more about that later, perhaps. At the same time, of course, using these techniques of visualization challenged me to think about the use of digital frameworks to facilitate and represent humanities scholarship, but also how they can contribute to our understanding of the Nazi genocide and the Holocaust and its aftermath. So in this presentation today, I would like to try to explain my research, focusing in particular on one place, Beshankovichi here, town in eastern Belarus, with a side note on Brychov, another place I've visited recently. And in the second kind of final part of the presentation, I'd like to kind of comment a little bit on what I think is the potential of visualization and digital approaches for both scholars, but also for the construction of communal memory. And I think that's very much what Caroline talked about as the societal impact that our scholarship actually has. So Belarus was what one might call a shtetl. In 1897, over 71% of the population was Jewish. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, many Jews, especially younger ones, left the town, moved to the larger capitals, so that by the late 1930s, actually around 16% of the population only was Jewish. But at the same time, in interviews, in memoirs, people continued to describe this place as a Jewish place, referring, for instance, to the fact that non-Jewish residents spoke Yiddish. Many students of Belarusian or Russian nationality enrolled in the Jewish 7-year school until it was closed in 1937. And also Jews and non-Jews lived side by side all over town. There was no particularly Jewish quarter that we often talk about. So when German troops occupied the region in late June 1941, this community was very quickly torn apart, with Jewishness emerging as the stigma that separated those who would live throughout the war and those who would not. And for instance, very quickly, in the first days of the war, many people report that local youth were emboldened by German propaganda and started to call their Jewish neighbors Jews, or Kike, if you will, as in the translation. So a very derogatory term for the people that they had lived with side by side for a long time. Very quickly, a German administration was established in the town with locals beginning to work for them, primarily for the local police, but also a village elder was appointed who, according to a number of reports, did not only enforce German rule, but appears to also have personally humiliated Jews, and together with local police often kicked Jews out of their homes to make room for locals who had lost their home during the fighting in the beginning of the war, or for German officers or police staff. At the same time, in July 1941, all Jewish residents were confined to a small number of homes, which we can talk about as a form of ghettoization, which of course disrupted networks, social networks, but also had a huge impact on their access to food, to heating material, and to other basic necessities. So in a sense, the racial division became very spatial very quickly. For a while, the Belarus ghetto was what we now call an open ghetto. That means there was no fence or no wall around it, but exit and entry were policed by guards. The Jewish inmates had to wear yellow stars on their front and on their back, so were stigmatized if they ever left the ghetto, which many of them did to work because the Jewish inmates of a particular age were forced to labor, and often that labor was not necessarily what we would think as productive, but more a form of humiliation in moving sand or bricks from one place to the next for no apparent reason. Beginning in the summer and fall, there were multiple arbitrary shootings of individual Jews. And that, of course, increased the sense of doom and anxiety among the Jewish community very quickly. On February 11th, in 1942, the separation and stigmatization culminated then in the execution of the Jewish community of Belarus. On that day, around 1,000 Jews were rounded up and marched through the town to an execution site in the nearby forest. Local policemen were instrumental in identifying Jews, pulling them out of their hiding places if they had managed to hide, but also guarded them together with German members of the Einsatzkommando on their journey through town. So the Jews were then taken through the town, and I'm just going to show you some of the sites in the form of what they look like today. So the Jews were taken through the town, across a bridge, across the river, up a hill on the other side of the western Dwina, and then alongside the road on the other side of the river into the forest, where a day before Soviet prisoners of war had been forced to dig 2 large pits in which about 1,000 Jews were then shot on that day. And multiple residents reported that they heard the shots all day long. Local residents were also included in sorting the clothing that had been left by Jews. So some of them have to have been very close by the shooting sites. And the next day, the clothes were auctioned off among the local population on the other side of the river, so they were brought back into town. The empty homes of Jewish families were then occupied by primarily non-Jews, many of whom had lost their own homes during the fighting in the summer of 1941. So that essentially marked the end of the Jewish community of Beshenkovichi that had existed for about 600 years in that place. The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission for ascertaining and investigating the crimes perpetrated by the German fascist invaders and their accomplices, short CGK, recorded 2 large grave sites for the murder of the Beshenkovichi Jews, but currently only one of them is actually known. So we would love to bring Caroline to Beshenkovichi to find out where the other killing site is. There are some indications, but it's obviously really hard to trace. The grave was not marked for several years. Only in 1958, a group of very few survivors, primarily these were Jews who had been evacuated at the beginning of the war or were fighting in the Soviet army, returned and were able to erect a memorial dedicated to the memory of what it says, 1,068 Soviet citizens killed by Hitlerites. So on one hand, the grave now became a very concrete and physical site of commemoration, but it also has a huge symbolic value because the number is actually not necessarily reflective of the actual number of people who are buried in this place. But it also acquired symbolic value in the sense that over the years, this place became what Pierre Nora described as a lieu de mémoire, essentially a memory site for the local Jewish community as a whole, because other traces of Jewish life in Beshenkovichi were more or less erased as well. Here you can see the Jewish cemetery in 2015, kind of abandoned, falling apart. Now there's a group of volunteers working to re-erect some of the gravestones and clean up the Jewish cemetery, which creates some friction in the larger Jewish community in the former Soviet Union for some of the very similar reasons in terms of not disturbing the peace of the deceased. But on the other hand, for instance, the former synagogue was used as a house of pioneers, later as a factory, and is now an abandoned building, but is not marked as a formerly Jewish building. Similarly, there was a picture at some point. The formerly Jewish school, which is now used as a dormitory by local police forces, but also has no indication that this once was a relevant building for the Jewish community. So, and over the years, the gravesite became more and more abandoned because more and more survivors have passed away. So even those people would not come anymore and visit the gravesite. And when I asked local residents if they ever go to this place to commemorate part of the community that was extinguished, most people said no. Some of them didn't even know that it exists. Some of them said it's too far away. Others invoked the specter of violence, saying that they were afraid of what had happened there. But others mentioned that, yeah, I saw that when I was collecting berries, or I picked up bricks from a nearby factory, but it doesn't really mean anything to me. The former local secretary of the Communal, which I was able to interview, said that she cannot recall that there was ever any effort among youth, among students, or among local authorities to include this site into practices of commemoration, which is very much in contrast to the other sites of commemoration that we have in Beshenkovichi, commemorating Soviet soldiers. I have this one here. Soviet soldiers, Soviet residents who fell while fighting for the Soviet Union in other places, and local partisan aides and local civilians that were shot at the end of the war by German forces. And so for me, this division between practices of commemoration, of remembering, really became clear when I created this map, and I tried to visualize these practices of remembering and commemoration. And it became very clear that what once was a Jewish shtetl with Jews living around town, then being confined to the ghetto territory, then marched through town to the gravesite, is very much divided from where the center of life currently is, but also the center of commemorating World War II, of course. Here's a much better rendition of this division created by Alison de Graaf Olivier, a former student of Anne's, actually, who now works as a cartographer, and helped me create this much better visualization. But so for me, visualization was very much a part of understanding what is actually going on in this community, and to what extent is the geography of memory also impacted by the historical experience, namely of the destruction outside of town, so just outside of town in some ways. So the role of geography for the construction of local war memory and the increased marginalization of the Jewish past, of what was the former Jewish Pale of Settlement, so one of the centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, is not unique for Bešińkovići, but a very similar process I could explain to you in the case of Bychów, where the Jewish community also had been very central to local culture and local life, but was then ghettoized in a castle on the edge of town, and after 3 weeks, at different moments, was killed at different shooting sites around town. And you can see they're kind of in the middle of nowhere. You kind of have to know where they are. And again, a similar map, and this is again my attempt to do that, where you can also see the shooting sites very much around town and removed from other places of commemoration, which we can also find here in Bychów. So these geographies, I would argue, exemplify very general trends in Belarus. They reveal, on the one hand, the integration of Jewish residences and cultural and social institutions in the pre-war geography of the towns, and on the other hand, emphasize how ghettoization and mass killing in the nearby forests or fields under German control removed not only the death and the bodies of the Jewish residents from the community, but also facilitated the marginalization of their memory in the post-war period. And this additional layer of violation is perhaps the most tragic testament to the Holocaust in the German-occupied Soviet territories, where alongside the destruction of Jewish communities and their cultural heritage, the knowledge about and the memory of the rich Jewish past of what once was the Jewish Pale settlement disappears and therefore in some ways completes the genocidal project. Last but not least, and in no small part, this externalization facilitates continued silence about local participation in the genocide, but I would also say also the trauma of losing a substantial part of the community that had been very essential for community life. So in the remaining minutes, I'd like to briefly turn to some comments on the potential of digital visualization methods to help tell the story of a divided geography of memory. After all, I created this visualization based on information that I had gathered and assembled, meaning a narrative that I had developed. Now I want to ask, can I go the other way? Is there a way to use visuality to tell this story? And what does this offer us? So in essence, what would be necessary is the visualization of the sources and their assemblage according to the places that have acquired meaning through them. At its core, I think this approach is what other scholars, Ian Gregory, David Bodenhammer have already been mentioned, have discussed under the rubric of deep mapping, meaning the depiction of a place or particular places and the meaning attached to it or to them. Conceptually, deep maps are detailed multimedia depictions of a place and all that exists within it, and they show the specific effects of geographical environments on emotions and behaviors of individuals. So in that sense, a deep map of Bešińkovići and its geography of memory would have to reveal how people relate to the bones and the ashes in the forest. To do that, it would also have to tell how these bones got there, whose bones they are. Meaning, a central part of the story is the history of Jewish life in Belarus and its destruction. So were I to create a deep map of Belarus that combines, for instance, textual, cartographic, visual representations of these places and attached meanings, it could look something like this. This is what I mean by pedestrian. A very complex network of information provided by different sources. And you can see here there's some testimonies, there's some photos I took, there's memoirs, there's some analytical work on, for instance, the history of the synagogue. There's archival material from different places. There's an archival photo from the dedication of the memorial. But there's also a Facebook post about local students who've recently worked on this site to clean it up, because one of the teachers who had supported me in my research decided that this site has to be part of the local community. It remains to be seen to what extent that actually is going to happen. So this rather convoluted depiction, of course, doesn't seem very useful. And there are a few applications that do this much better. Some of you may know, for instance, Neatline, a plugin to Anika, a platform that I've been dabbling with, but I'm not able to show you an actual result. I kind of condensed it to one moment in time here. Usually you would have a timeline where you would see different images, and then you can click on some of these dots on the map to see a visual representation. StoryMap is another application that I think works in a very similar way. But both of these are largely limited to visual material and does omit a very crucial aspect, namely that much of the documentation that we have from the Holocaust, especially in this area, is not visual, but for instance, oral. So oral histories, testimonies are very crucial for us to reconstruct the history, but also the history of the memory. And so we might say that the oral transmission of memory has very different internal dynamics and ought to be valued as such, and very much has to be part of representations of this kind. Because of, for instance, tone of voice, how people take pauses, how they are silent, is very much very much part of the story. It needs to be represented here. So to tell the story, to create an archive that allows us to develop a narrative of this particular kind, in other words, I think we need to go beyond the visual and include a variety of other sources. Some scholars have tried to create what they call a greedy deep map, so a map or an assemblage of any kind of available information. Other people like Todd Presner have worked on so-called thick maps to include multiple perspectives of one particular place at one particular time. So kind of both working diachronically and synchronically. He talked about that, I think, very well yesterday. And I think being able to incorporate both that multiplicity of sources, but also of perspectives, would be a central part of trying to create narratives that enable us to understand the dynamics of both the history of the Holocaust, but also its memory. And of course, that has important opportunities for education and research. I think I don't need to go into too much detail here, but what I would highlight is that it has a huge impact, or can have a huge impact for the construction of communal memory, especially in a place where Belarus, where there's actually an increasing lack of knowledge about what has actually happened, would be a very good way to kind of bring back some of the information and analysis that has been developed elsewhere by people like me, but also by many of you. And we often don't bring this analysis back. We don't often bring our scholarship back to these places, and maybe digital approaches here could make an important impact. Not the least is if you look at the variety of sources, I think to some extent that also resembles the huge scale of dispersal and displacement produced by the genocide itself. So it can kind of try to help recreate a community that has been destroyed during the genocide. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I think that might give us something to talk about also in combination with the previous presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anika. Questions from the audience?
Thank you. And thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm just like two quick questions. First, correct me if I'm wrong, but anti-Semitism in Belarus it's growing. So I'm sort of, how is your work received in Belarus? And also, do you know are there any Belarusian scholars doing this similar sort of research?
Thank you for that question. It's a question I often get. And I think my answer would combine kind of both questions. I mean, anti-Semitism in Belarus is always a big topic, and it certainly exists. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's any stronger now than it was 5 years ago. So I don't really see a growth or an increase in that. And in regards to how this kind of scholarship is perceived and whether Belarusians pursue it themselves, I've given a lot of lectures recently in Belarus talking about some of this more recent research, but also about my previous work, which very much tried to actually tell the story of how young Soviet Jews survived the Nazi genocide and the Holocaust in these territories. Was very well received, in part because local scholars actually can't do that kind of work. So there's still a lot of limitations to what people can do, and not necessarily because they don't get the archival documents, but there's very few outlets where they can publish, for instance. There's no doctoral dissertation that has been approved ever in Belarus on the topic of the Holocaust. And that certainly has something to do with the fairly tight grip that the very authoritarian state has on the educational institutions in Belarus. But at the same time, when I give lectures, when I give presentations, when I go to places like Beshenkovici, there's a lot of people who come and who are interested and want to know this history. And they say, we know that what we learn in school, we know that what we study in the university is only half the story. We know that there are blind spots, and we would like to fill them. And kind of invite and are very, very open to people from abroad who come to bring their analysis back, if you will, but would like to contribute. And that's kind of what I'm currently trying to do with some colleagues in Belarus. But it doesn't necessarily receive state support. If that is your question, it's very pessimistic, I think. Although in some ways the construction of memorial sites currently in Minsk, in Malý Trostenec, for instance, make me hope for a little bit of a better time at some point, but we'll see.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I loved your deep map, by the way. But I want to pick up actually on what Caroline, her word forensic, and this is kind of, it's really for everybody, but it was your quote unquote animation, right? As we walk through the village with the digital photograph. I'm really interested in how that element of the digital photograph that is now ubiquitous, right? 20 years ago, if you're an historian, you would not have a photograph in any presentation whatsoever. Now we all use that, and it's because, of course, we can take hundreds of digital photographs instead of just taking one of, say, the mass grave. And so that very banal but very ubiquitous digital technology. Could you talk a little bit about how you think about that in your own work? Does it make you think in spatial narrative way? I'm like, is it pressing you to different kinds of questions? And do you think, has that changed the way that the field is really asking different kinds of questions? Just that basic technology that we overlook every day.
Yeah, I think historians are very reluctant to embrace ethnographic research. I think that hasn't necessarily changed very much. That's why I keep saying that I'm actually not a historian, even though I teach in a history department. But I have been trained very much interdisciplinary, so I'm actually very poorly trained in any discipline, if you will. But I found, I don't... When I go to these places, I have a question that I want to answer. I'm not just randomly collecting information, but I have a very concrete question, which of course might change based on the material that I collect. So when I went to Beshenkovici for the first time, I had my camera with me all the time. I have literally hundreds of photos, and it's part of the problem, actually. But it enabled me to kind of reconstruct my own trajectory of research. When I went back home, I uploaded the photos to the computer, and I could literally trace my way through the town, and then sometimes saw things I hadn't really paid attention to. For instance, you'll see there's no people in those photos, right? But there are people. I talked to a lot of them, actually. But it made me wonder, did they hide from me, or did I just manage to be out there at the time that everybody was inside their homes? So there are some questions that I still have. But primarily, I think I took the pictures because I often feel like we often talk about, especially the Holocaust, as this thing that happened, this event that happened so far away, but we never see it. We never see the impact that it had. We never see the sites where it actually happened and where it did destroy communities. So in some ways, for me, the first impulse actually was to take pictures, to bring them back, and to show an audience like here, this is what it looks like, and this is what Belarus looks like. But then, as you already said, it actually enables us, I think, to do a different kind of work, because I can reconstruct the path that people went on to go to the killing site in this very strong visual way, and it shows me that it really went through the town, it went across the river, it went up the hill. So it's the very physicality that I could probably describe with words. But there's something else, and I'm still struggling with that myself. I mean, I don't think I have actually a good answer to your question. But I think ethnographic research has to become much more part of what we do as historians, because I think we can't only look to the past. We actually need to understand how the past impacts the present, and that's one way of accessing that.
Any other questions for Anika's paper before we get to general questions? Nope. I would like to invite Erik and Anne to come back up. If there are any questions from the audience for them. I would like to start first, though. I have a question because I have the microphone, so I can start first. I have a question about sources, since all your work is so interdisciplinary, and I study the conquest of Peru, which is nearly 500 years ago. We don't quite have the sources, but one of the things I notice is how certain sources erase certain types of things. So I wonder if you all could comment on what you've noticed about how certain types of documents, archaeology and oral histories, how they erase certain parts of this past, and how you can combine these different types of evidence to reconstruct this past. And then I also will add a proposal. Is it possible, perhaps, to map the differences in these sources? In the Humanities, we so often map events, we map processes, we map places themselves, but what about mapping the archive or the collection of data? And what that can show us about gaps in the different documentary records, and how that can help us integrate these different sources. So I don't know if any of you want to respond to that.
I can try to start. As for the sources that erase certain things, I think that's precisely what I was trying to get at with envisioning what I would like digital frameworks to do, namely to enable us to combine different sources that combine different perspectives on particular situations. So, for instance, Anne actually had a screenshot of Yahadin Unum on there, of one of the witnesses from Beşenkovici, whose testimony I worked with. And you actually had the precise moment that was so central for me, where she says, I was sledding at the Ravin, and that was the day of the execution. So she was sledding with her friend, watching 1,000 Jews being led across the ice to their execution. And I have an oral history with a man who was at the time was 8 years old, who was in that group of Jews, and describes what it felt like to walk across the ice. So there's a very, very different perspectives, but of the very same moment in time and in place, if you will. And I think combining those different perspectives can give us a good idea of the complexity of human experience. And historical experience that, in one case, has been erased. As for the mapping the differences of sources, I'm going to defer to other people.
Thank you. Well, I think from my point of view, obviously, as you saw, I tried to layer lots of different sources together. And one of the reasons for that is because each of the types of material I mentioned, of course, has its strengths, but also has its limitations. So, I mean, of course, I'm not going to go through all of them. But, I mean, for example, for Treblinka, there are no aerial photographs of when the camp was in operation. So you are solely reliant on extermination. That's the extermination camp, that is. You are solely reliant on maps from before the camp was built and then images that show the aftermath. So there's obviously something there, a big gap that needs to be filled by the other types of surveying methods that we do. And that's, of course, why we apply the geophysical methods. But even with the geophysical methods, for example, I will never just do, almost always never just do ground penetrating radar, because that sends out one type of signal and detects one type of material, whereas another type of geophysical survey, for example, magnetometry, detects different types of changes in the ground, such as burning or the disturbance of the soil, for example. So it's always about kind of building layer upon layer of source material. And of course, in my case, that's even more important because often we aren't allowed to excavate, particularly when we're talking about mass graves. So I'm very much reliant there on the testimonies and the source material. Actually, just one thing, because we're here at the Shoah Foundation in particular, I just also wanted to mention, and which I was thinking about yesterday as well in terms of testimonies. As I said, of course, for me, they're incredibly important sources of material. But there are always things that they don't say. And often as an archaeologist, I'm sitting there thinking, why didn't you ask that question? And of course, it's often to do with the motivations behind the interview in the first place. And I do have to say that one of the most frustrating things about a lot of testimonies is when often people offer to show maps or objects in those testimonies, and then the interviewer goes, "Oh, we don't have time for that." And I think that was mentioned yesterday. And of course, that's something you can't go back and rectify. So for me, that's perhaps a kind of frustration, but a gap that has to be filled by other materials.
Jeremy, that's such a wonderful question. It helps me recognize a problem in my own thinking, that I have been so fixated for so many years on the inadequacies of GIS for handling experience and movement and various other crucial aspects of the Holocaust, which I have seen as an enormous deficit in our work, that I haven't thought, well, why don't we show those differences a little more plainly? I mean, you sort of knocked something loose, so thank you. As everyone in this room, I think, knows already, the differences between what one can extract and then demonstrate out of perpetrator documents is so different from the fluidity, ambiguity, et cetera, of testimony. So, and I just would want to highlight, in dealing with testimony, one of the great frustrations to a geographer is that place is so poorly, inadequately, inaccurately described, if it's described at all. We started in 2007 in our first gathering looking at Elie Wiesel's Night, and I thought naively, oh, there's going to be lots about Auschwitz in this book. And we tried to map it, and it was impossible and frustrating, and that was the beginning of that enduring frustration. But more recently, I have begun to think that it would be possible, I can envision it, to build a large, complex, group-produced historical GIS of the Holocaust that would combine an enormous amount of data from all parties, would help get us beyond the perpetrator-victim division, and could be enormously revealing, but that's one of the things that requires $5 to $10 million. But I can see it. I can see it.
Good question. Obviously, a really important one. And I guess what I would add is a couple things. One of the things that we're always looking to do is look for alternative sources that you wouldn't really expect to be valuable from a spatial standpoint. And I think you saw that evidence in some of our work at looking at novels. Novels have a capacity, particularly ones in historical settings, have a capacity to capture a place and its dynamics in ways that census records really cannot. And so if you can figure out ways to map the entities in novels, you have a really ability to see into that space in ways that you wouldn't see if you only relied on concrete tabular records that are more typical. As far as mapping are the inadequacies of sources, this obviously is a challenge because you can't know what you do not know. And so one of the things that I would say that we do is, in for example, sites like the Budapest project where you're mapping locations onto a historical street network for which you have actually created all of the address ranges and the names of streets, and you're matching that to a database. A kind of unwise approach is to simply say, assume that you've done that correctly and there's no human error in that process, or your sources that led you to create the database that actually is the index for the mapping of the material could be inaccurate, is simply map that material, and the pattern that you get reveals something about the data itself, but also the process you went through to create that database. So one of the things we often do is we'll actually investigate, do visualizations of possible errors and identify spaces that are underrepresented because perhaps you've made a mistake. And the visualization tools can help significantly in that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it. And I want to go back, Anne, to your first comment, which is, of course, visualization has to be part of the whole process, or one of your but because there, I do think, though, I'd like to push that a little bit and ask you whether you all could reflect on when visualization is most important for your particular research questions, because there does seem to be slightly different weights. It seems to me, Anne and Erik, it's the middle point, right? Visualization is a process of exploration. Caroline, yours was visualization was a little bit at the early point, right? It's about the forensic, it's about the evidence. And Anika, yours was kind of at the end point. It's about kind of the synthetic understanding. So I mean, and again, I realize you use all three, but I wonder if you could tell us where visualization is kind of most important for your particular research questions during the process.
I think for me, in terms of the aspect of my research that has probably the most potential to have impact in terms of revisiting the narratives of the Holocaust is at that identification stage. So I think for me, the digital technologies have offered new ways to record forensic evidence and to identify it. So I mean, simply, just after the Holocaust, and even in recent decades, this technology didn't exist. So the ability to be able to visualize what lies beneath the ground on a huge scale, an unprecedented scale, which even if these technologies had existed at the time, allow you access to large areas of land way over and above that you could ever excavate, even if you wanted to. So I think that for me has been the greatest aspect. I mean, in a way, the ethical issues that surrounded this, I don't like to use the word forced, but channeled me, if you like, towards creating this non-invasive approach. But now, on reflection, I would never go back and change that. I never would have started with excavation, because those methods allowed us to say so much about inside the camp boundaries themselves, and of course the surrounding landscape, which we shouldn't forget. There's those liminal spaces as well. And so I think for me, the identification of mass graves in particular, of course, that's where I think the visualization is the most valuable, because that is most often the question that people want to know is where, just as with Anika's work, where are these graves located?
Yes and no. I think it is more at the end in some ways. But on the other hand, being able to see the place, to visualize it to myself, I think was actually really important. I mean, for reasons I've already described. It's just like being able to walk this place, walk the journey, look around. What would have people seen? Even though, of course, I know that some of the trees wouldn't have been there at the time. They're actually quite new. But a lot of the homes that I've seen were there at the time already. So I could see that there were neighbors that were probably in those homes who were watching this. So based on that, I could then try to find people who saw the roundup, but also who would have interacted with people when they were in the ghetto. So So I mean, I guess that's just part of ethnographic research. You go to a site and use visual material to define your questions. And then, I think the representation of the analysis certainly is more at the end.
I hope you won't think I'm being facetious. To answer your question with a quotation from Stephen Sondheim's Sunday in the Park with George. Isn't that the title? Yeah. I was recently reminded of it because I love Mandy Patinkin, and I was listening to Finishing the Hat. How I like to finish the hat. How I have to finish the hat. It's a song about his creative process, Seurat's creative process as an artist. And I claim no similarity to Seurat, except that for me, every project I have done, Holocaust, pre-Holocaust, future possible work, begins with a map that I see in my imagination, and I feel throughout the whole project as if I am trying to finish the map. I'm trying to do the work necessary to make the map that was the initial insight, and even if the work then demonstrates that my initial insight was completely wrong, that I think is the most important visual work for me.
During the Q&A after our talk, I put up on the screen, I don't know if anyone looked at it, but a well-known model of the difference between cartography and visualization. That's McEachran's model of cartography cubed that he produced in the 1990s. And the strong distinction that he makes there is the difference between visualization and cartography is that visualization is a process of revealing unknowns versus presenting knowns. It's a process of high map, human map interaction versus low interaction. And lastly, that visualization is primarily done in private versus cartography is primarily for the public. That model still holds in many ways, but I think what has shifted really is that it's no longer a private activity. And I think that's what we're seeing here, is that we're able to produce things that retain high map interaction and help reveal unknowns to audiences that we didn't, that we didn't expect. Types of interactivity that we didn't expect, types of engagement we didn't expect, revealing new questions that we didn't expect. And so I think the distinction so much isn't when it comes in the research, but it's how much is visualization part of that whole spectrum, and how has that become more public?
Thank you. When Anne was speaking, I got this image in my head about a map. It's in the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, like in the big hallway. There's a map that it shifts, so it goes through time. So Germany is never a constant; it's moving all over the geography. And I was just thinking along those lines because, as I said yesterday, I've been going to Berlin quite a lot with students on field trips, looking at both Nazi Germany and the GDR. And Berlin is just perfect because you get all these layers of history. You have like the Kaiserreich, you have Weimar Germany, you have Nazi Germany, you have the GDR, and you have the United Germany. And so you have all these layers of stories as well. And many of them are located in a place. Like, for instance, Sachsenhausen, where you have the concentration camp, you have the Soviet special camp, and then you have the GDR period, etc., etc. And I was just thinking, like, when you visualizing places, also for pedagogical purposes, how can we use this with students? In bringing sources in, like different kinds of source material, both the victim perspective, the perpetrator perspective, the bystander perspective, but also the historiographical perspective. How are these places being interpreted through history? And that kind of, interactive visualization of like the Holocaust or any genocide, actually, because every genocide has got its historiography. Its interpretations through time. That, I think, that would be like really, really interesting. And also, when we talk about the Holocaust, I think also, and this is, I think, mostly for Caroline, when we talk about sources, should we bring in the deniers and front that? And if we do stuff like that, if we sort of bring in different kinds of source material and talk about how do we create knowledge by using different sources, different layers, or do we shut it out? And this is, I think, is an ethical question, but I would really like your comments on this.
Okay, well, I'll start with the first question. I mean, from my point of view, and this links to Paul's question as well, I guess, for us, of course, archaeology is all about layers. It's all about the kind of different, so we can't escape that, even if we wanted to. So I think for me, I absolutely agree that telling the story of these places, both before and after, is absolutely really important. And actually, of course, I've run out of time massively, but had I not, then I would have shown a very quick slide about a project that I'm currently involved in, which is now an international project and it's called Accessing Campscapes, and it's all about that very thing that you mentioned there. It's all about showing, it's all about providing access to the public to the multiple histories of these places. It brings together archaeologists, oral history experts, experts in memory studies, and experts in visualization. And we particularly chose camps from the Holocaust and from the Soviet era, which have multiple layers of meaning. So, for example, just the week before we came here, we were in Camp Westerbork, which, of course, had many camps in its terrain, including a camp for Moluccans in the 1970s, which is still seen as very controversial. And we're working with museums and memorials also to see how they negotiate those multiple histories and layers of meaning. So I think that's something visually that we absolutely have to try and represent, and something with our students that we absolutely should engage with, because we shouldn't just be seeing these sites as static during the Holocaust, but also after, because there has been a lot of, as I mentioned before, manipulation, uses and abuses of the past. And so to link to your second point, of course, one of those uses of the past has been the use of material and information by deniers. And I do think that is something that's incredibly important to bring into work with students, work with the public, and also into our own academic reflections. I will say from my own point of view, it's something I find really difficult quite to engage with, because obviously it does sometimes elevate to a level of quite violent activity. So really what you want to do is really just kind of run away from it in some ways. But on the other hand, I think engaging with it is absolutely, it is important, and it's important to show, particularly from our, when we do this kind of work, the impact and the resonance that it can have. I suppose sometimes the way that people explain it to me is it's the kind of thing, there's no such thing as bad publicity kind of statement. Maybe that's not the best analogy, but in the sense that the work that we do, whether that reaction is good or bad, or whether it's from deniers, it sparks some sort of reaction. So in a way, we have to respond to those reactions, no matter what they are.
Your question reminds me of a wonderful teaching idea that I learned from Todd Presner when he was at Maine as my guest recently, with his design seminar, but one could do this with any students, 6-year-olds included. He has them clear a room on the classroom floor, put down an enormous piece of paper, and have them start drawing a map together. So you can also do this by maybe printing out on a large format printer an outline of Berlin, or maybe you have 3 outlines of Berlin at 3 different times, and they get together in their little subgroups and they start drawing in what was there at that time and what questions does that raise, so that at almost zero cost, you get them thinking spatially. It's not top down. It doesn't take an enormous amount of prep by the teacher, which is something that these methods can make very daunting for one. Bringing this stuff into the classroom can be really frightening. Anyway, just an idea.
Okay, we're about quick question.
Okay, so we talked about various methodologies, tools that we used to visualize different places, etc. But I have one most important question to all of you. Why did you choose this given particular place? What was the relation between you and a specific place that you decided to conduct research, to analyze, and to visualize?
I'll answer first because it's really short. I got a phone call from someone at the Holocaust Museum in 2005 saying, "We hear it's possible to use GIS to study the Holocaust. What do you think?"
Well, obviously, from my point of view, we've done lots of different projects for lots of different reasons. So more recently, as Kevin mentioned, we are beginning to attract funding for this kind of work more regularly. We're being commissioned to do this kind of work. In the beginning, really, my desire to do this was because I couldn't believe that, in the first instance, that people hadn't used archaeological methods to look at the Holocaust. Then when I discovered that they had, and I discovered the kind of outrage in many cases that it had caused, I felt it was very important to try and readdress that. And then the first place I visited after making that decision was Treblinka. And I think ultimately with Treblinka, the scale of what happened there, to suggest, as I said, that no evidence survived just seemed improbable. So I felt like if I could demonstrate that the evidence would survive at somewhere like Treblinka, where the history books suggested it was so improbable, hopefully it would demonstrate the potential to do that in other places. And so, of course, it's equally as important to do that for all the spaces.
I could tell a very long story, but I'm not going to do that. But I went to Belarus because beginning in 2002, I began to interview survivors of what we now call the Holocaust, who were living in St. Petersburg in Russia at the time, but all had been in Belarus during the war, who had been born there, who were raised in Soviet Belarusia, and then survived either in ghettos or in hiding or in partisan units. And one of the men that I was able to interview was born in Belarus, lived there and survived. And I interviewed him multiple times. A few years ago, I decided I actually needed to go back to Belarus to actually look at the place, to kind of retrace his path, because it was very complicated, because he actually managed to run away from the execution site and then was hidden by a family. And that just kind of went into a spiral of collecting more and more information about this particular place. But very similarly, I became interested in other towns where I had bits and pieces of information that had grown out of an earlier project on the Holocaust in the Soviet territories.
All right, thank you. Now we're out of time, officially. I want to thank the presenters. If the moral imperative of Holocaust studies is never to forget, or an Anika study to remember times and events forgotten, I think these presenters did a very good job of showing how these new techniques can help us meet that imperative. So give them one last round of applause.